Okay. You hear me? Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for being here, and also for POLIN Conference, the organizer, and all the sponsors. So I'm going to present a paper on Yiddish-speaking Jewish communists from Poland, most of them at least, in Paris. And I'm going to present social and political trajectories of these activists. In 1943, Sonia Bianchi, a young Jew from a petit bourgeois and traditional family, left her native Poland for France. She had to leave because, as a member of the youth organization of the Communist Party, she almost got caught by the police. In Poland at that time, the Communist Party was in clandestine. Communist activists were prosecuted by the police and faced the risk to go to prison for a long time. In her family, Sonia was the only one among 7 children to join the Communist Party. Her parents preferred to see her leave Poland rather than to stay and go to prison. They could not bear the idea of everyone knowing that one of their daughters was in prison. They were indeed deeply embarrassed and ashamed that by a political commitment that they saw as too radical and different from their own way of life. But for Sonia, joining the Communist Party was only a natural path, given the injustices she was seeing every day. She could have joined another political party, such as the Bund. However, a Jewish political party did not seem to be an option for her. In an interview she gave in 1984, she never mentioned her Jewishness as an explanation of her political commitment. She even barely mentioned the fact that her family was Jewish and her father was a Jewish scholar. In France, she started a life in Strasbourg, where one of her sisters was living a bourgeois life with her husband, 2 children, a steady job, and even a nurse for the child. Sonia could not stand such a way of life and decided to go to Paris. There she lived the life of numerous Jewish immigrants, an insecure job, no money to pay a hotel room for several nights in advance, a political commitment that endangered her stay in France, since she only had a temporary permit. Her sister offered her some money, but she refused, preferring to respect her ideals, political ideals, and to learn how to live as a member of the working class. Soon she married a French communist guy, non-Jewish one, to become French herself and not to risk to be expelled from France. She was very active in the Jewish groups of the French Communist Party. During the war, she was a member of the Jewish communist resistance against Nazis and collaborationists in France. After the war that she survived, she became a member of the Jewish Communist Organization in Paris. All her family in Poland was killed. She ran an orphan for children in France, and then she joined a French communist organization where she worked as a director of a French-Hungarian, non-Jewish this time, orphan for children. She never stopped being a communist until the end of her life. Her political engagement could be considered radical in many ways. Firstly, it was extremely different from a family tradition and led to some conflicts with her parents. Secondly, joining a clandestine party had harsh consequences and led her to leave Poland for good and never see her family again. Finally, this also led her to be part of the most radical Jewish resistance in France during World War II. Sonia Bianchi is one of the Jewish communists I study in my PhD, whose subject is the reconstruction of the Jewish communist life after the Holocaust in Paris, through the study of several associations and their members. Several chapters of my dissertation focus on Jewish communist activists themselves. I follow their political path since the beginning of their political engagement in the interwar year in Poland to the end of their life. To what extent Sonia Bianchi's path is similar or different from others? As a woman, does she represent an exception among Jewish communists? I specifically decided to choose to choose her case to start my paper because I wanted to put the light on the gender dimension of Jewish communist history. Most leaders and people who left traces in the archives are indeed men. Where are the women, and did they play gender-based role or not? This is a question I would like to ask among others. In the first part, I will briefly come back to my dissertation and explain my methodology to follow activists and choose them. Then I will present the cohort of activists I follow, and I will answer several questions. What was their political, sociological, cultural, and religious background? When and why did they become communists, and to what extent their Jewishness was a key explanation of this political choice? What was the consequences of this political engagement on their relationship with their family and on their personal paths, notably immigration? Why did they choose France? Then in the third part, I will follow them after World War II and wondered what role they played after the war and what was their political career, both in Jewish communist organizations and in French communist structures, such as the French Communist Party. Okay, so I will start with some context and background. In the 30s in France, numerous Jews left Poland because of anti-Semitism, its violence, and its social and economic consequences for them. Thousands of Jews settled in Paris. Among them were communist Jews like Sonia Bianchi, who had known political repression or even prison because of their involvement in the Communist Party. When they arrived in France, they joined the French Communist Party, which created specific structures for immigrants who did not speak French yet. The Jewish subsection was called Jewish because most of its members was one of the most dynamic and tried to spread communism among immigrant Jews through a dense network of associations, mutual aid societies, and Yiddish newspapers. Most of its members were Jews from Poland, some others were from Lithuania or Romania. During the Second World War, they took part in the resistance of the special group, the Jewish group, and fought against the Nazis and the collaborationists. They also created several clandestine organizations whose goal was to rescue and help Jews who faced persecution. After the war and the Holocaust, Jewish communists recreated numerous associations who had disappeared during the war and were highly active in the reconstruction of the Jewish life. My dissertation is about Jewish communists and their organization, their involvement in the reconstruction of Jewish life, and their relationship with the French Communist Party, and their strategy to be reinstated in France in their own rights after 5 years of persecution and exclusion. One thing I particularly value is to study both the organizations and their activists. Since the 90s, many studies have focused on the question of individual engagement and its determinant in the context of a revival of biographical analysis and the story of life. However, some sociologists invite researchers to be more attentive to the link between macro-social transformation and political engagement, and to better take into account the organizational shaping of militancy. This is why it seems important to me to jointly study both political and associative structures, the whole group and individual paths, and to never forget the influence of multiple contexts in individual engagement. It is, however, not always easy to identify activists and to find sources that give the opportunity to follow their paths. The major difficulty for me was to identify some activists in the organization I focus on, and most importantly, to find enough information to follow them. I selected Jewish communists who were members of some associations, and I can't present them here. To give you an idea of the numbers, the main organization I studied was composed approximately of 5,000 or 6,000 members in 1945, but the whole, let's say, Jewish communist sector in Paris was probably composed of 20,000 persons or more. However, the real activists, the ones who were who were leaders, who were in the streets, etc., were fewer, and left even fewer traces in the archives. In my research, I managed to identify and gather the name of approximately 100 individuals at the beginning. However, when I tried to find sources about these 100 individuals, I realized I could not follow them. I had some names, some main information, but not really enough to follow them. And so I decided to narrow my focus on the people I could really follow, which led me to choose 24 activists, let's say 30, but today I will present only 24, who are all leaders of this organization, which means they are not really representative, but I will come back to that. What sources can I use? Materials such as the archives of Jewish Communist Organization, of course, files of activists of at the French Communist Party, police archives, both in Poland, Belgium, and France, because a lot of them came to France through Belgium first, memoirs of activists who are necessarily not numerous, and oral history. Most of these activists are dead today, but I could had interview with their children who gave me some information on their parents. It seems important to be able to compare similar sources on these activists, and this is what I can do with these 24 activists, because I generally have the same kind of sources. In this paper, I will focus on these 24 activists. They were, as I said, mostly high-rank activists with responsibilities in Jewish Communist Organization and the French Communist Party. This is why we can find archives on them. Being generally more educated than the masses, as I say, they were also able to write their memoirs. Just a precision, even though they are a minority and had to be considered as exceptional, given the fact that they were leaders, their profile can help us understand Jewish communists in France in general. At least I hope. Now I'm going to present them to try to do a portrait of the group. Let's start with the socio-economic background. So to start, they were all part of the same generation. They were all born between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. I only found 6 women for 18 men. So these 6 women played the role of leaders also, but were a minority. Among these 24, as you can see, most of them were from Poland, but not all of them, since their group was based on Yiddish and not really nationality. About the socio-economic milieu, they all came from working class family or petit bourgeois. However, even the bourgeois family had economic issues in Poland. Most of these families indeed suffered from the First World War, particularly the one doing business. Some had to move because of population displacement in Poland and lost everything. Later, some families discovered poverty because of the death of one parent too. Furthermore, in Poland in the 20s and 30s, Jews faced more and more economic discrimination, which impacted harshly these families. These economic and social situations often had influences on the activists I follow. They faced injustice and discrimination. For instance, they also could not go to university for some of them and wanted to fight it. Regarding the political views of the family, none of the parents of the activists I study were already active communists. 1/3 was religious, another third without any opinion, at least in the sources I gathered. The children are not saying anything. And the last third was supporting their children's political engagement without being engaged themselves. And finally, concerning education, a minority of these activists only had a primary instruction. The majority had a secondary education, baccalaureate, and then some years of university, usually in Western Europe when they moved. It has to be noticed that it is an exception, however, due to the fact that they were leaders of the association I study. Most members of Jewish Communist Organization, rank-and-file activists, were manual workers who could not study and who came from poorer families than these activists. Concerning their political engagements, a majority of them became communist in their country of origin, so mostly Poland, but others joined firstly political movements such as the Bund or leftist Zionist movements such as Poale Zion or Hashomer HaTzair, before becoming communist in the countries they settled after their immigration, Belgium or France. Why did they become communist activists? They usually present several reasons, such as the influence of the Soviet Revolution when they were still in Poland, the desire to overcome anti-Semitism and inequalities between people through socialism, a conflict with the traditional and religious Jewish societies they lived in, or the will to become active as Jews and not to suffer in silence, as they say. Some of them indeed considered that their parents did not fight enough against pogroms and anti-Semitism in Poland, for instance. When did they arrive in France? Most of them between the end of the 20s and 1932, except for two of them in my corpus. Most of them left Poland or the country they were from after having been arrested one time for their political engagement. Why did they choose France or Belgium? It is hard to find. They don't always explain it, but usually they chose French because it was a myth, if you will, of the country of the droits de l'homme, so the men's rights, the country of revolution and the country of emancipation. The one who reached Belgium first were usually sent to Belgium thanks to networks they had created in Poland, notably the Secours Rouge, I don't know how to say it in English, a communist organization that was in Poland but also spread in Western Europe. So the majority went directly to Belgium or France, but a minority of them went first to Palestine and then decided to go back to France. One went to Brazil because his family was in Brazil, and another one, not a Polish one though, a Lithuanian one, went to South Africa first. When they arrived in France, after the first immigration, they all had to work as manual worker at first. So on the 24, 20 had a manual work that was very difficult. As immigrants who did not speak yet French, they could not really be employed and could not work officially. They could reside in France, but they did not always have an authorization to work, which made their life more complicated. A minority had other jobs, so there were two lawyers, one dentist, and another one I don't remember. But they experienced all poverty at that time, a clandestine life again, because they had to hide their job and be careful as communists because they were targeted by the police in France at that time. And finally, a minority of them, only a minority, went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War to fight alongside Spanish Republicans. Okay, so this is for the interwar years. What about World War II? So except for a minority of them who was prisoner of war, free on the 24, most of these activists were resistant fighters during the war and had major responsibilities, such as creating and leading a group at the national, regional, or local level in France. And they were all members of the main organization I studied in my PhD, which is the Union des Juifs pour la Résistance et l'Entraide, a group that was designed to help Jews to resist, but also to help Jews who couldn't really actively resist. As during the interwar years, these responsibilities were very much gender-oriented. I did not really mention it yet. Even though it has been reasoned that in the fighting groups of the French Communist Party, there were more women than in other groups, but all women of my corpus were in charge of organizing groups of resistance for women or did assistant work like helping families in need or hiding children. Men were mostly engaged in armed resistance or like more national level organization. A minority only of these activists was arrested, tortured, and imprisoned in France, one of them, and only 3 were deported. I can explain that because I picked them in 1945, so of course they did not die, which does not represent the path of most Jewish communists of that time, because in French and in the Jewish French communist resistance during World War II, a lot of activists died in the battlefield, if we can call that battlefield. So of course my activists are picked after the war, so they survive. Jewish communist political engagement led them to radical choices: clandestine life in their country of origin, prison, immigration, the risk to be expelled from Belgium and France because of their political activity, fighting for some of them in Spanish Civil War and in the Jewish communist resistance. All of these choices were radical for them and led them to these choices. After the war, the French Communist Party feared that immigrants, all of them, not only Jews, but all immigrants in the French Communist Party, would ask for more independence after 4 years of war, during which they were more or less autonomous from the party. The party decided to reassert its control and to integrate all immigrants in the French structure. To say it differently, it wanted to suppress the Jewish communist organization. However, although Jews from the Jewish section were willing to become more a part of the French communist structure, they also wanted to keep their own organization. They managed to convince the French Communist Party thanks to a political argument. Communism was not yet settled among Jewish immigrants in France, so Yiddish-speaking Jewish communist organization was necessary, notably to compete with Bundist and Zionist organizations, which were important in France at that time. But at the same time, they did not want to keep their organization only for a political strategy. They also knew that only Jewish organization could take care of Jewish specific problems after 4 years of persecution and exclusion in France, a point that the historiography has too often reduced to a political strategy only. As historian Gerben Zagsma puts in an article about Jewish communists in France in the interwar year, it is important to inject some nuance in a debate that often moves between 2 poles. Jewish communists are either seen as calculating internationalists for whom defending Jewish interests were merely a propagandistic corollary to the Comintern struggle against fascism, or they were viewed as Jewish Yiddish culture-loving true Jewish communists. And this dichotomy is problematic because it suggests that communist propaganda and a defense or concern with Jewish interests were mutually exclusive or antagonistic. This is what, in my PhD, I want to show the complex and multiple identities of Jewish communists. I argue that despite their political engagement and their true belief in communism, most Jewish communists of this generation never stopped being Jews and fighting for Jews, as the existence of their organization after the war proves. So I don't think I have the time to go through their path after the war, unfortunately, but I can go to my conclusion now. Just to say that, first of all, the activists I study, of course, as I told you, are exceptional in the sense that they are not representative of the rank-and-file activists. What distinguishes them is their intellectual formation and culture, which was a major asset for them to be chosen to play a role in the French Communist Party and in Jewish communist organization, because contrary to what has been reasoned until now, Jewish communist organizations were not independent. It's the French Communist Party who decided which activists will play a role or not in this specific Jewish communist organization. So they had to have some quality, as the party puts it, to play leading role at that time. Another major thing is that they played important roles since the interwar year and were already major figures of the Jewish communist organization in the interwar years, but also during the war, which explained that they were generally chosen by the Communist Party because of their heroic act during the war. There were a minority of women among them. The rare women played a gender role, such as work with children, notably after the war. Most of them were in the Jewish Communist Children Organization. But behind each man, there was a woman who was generally as engaged as her husband during the war, even if it was gender role position. But a lot of the wife of the activist I study stopped their political career after the war to raise the kids of the family. So only one person in the couple could carry on their militancy, and it was usually the man. Most of them were communist until their death, but there was a major difference between two profiles I could not really describe here. The one who stayed in France until the end of their life and stayed communist until the end, despite the red anti-Semitism that was in USSR and in Poland. But some activists decided in the 40s to go back to Poland to build socialism. These activists, most of them, came back to France in 1968 and cut the ties with the French Communist Party and with communism in general because of what happened in Poland in 1968. And this is a major difference in this group. The one who stayed in France and stayed communist, and the one who left for Poland, came back to France and decided not to be communist anymore. And this is a point I will talk about in my dissertation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your paper. And right now I would like to ask, sorry, my glasses. Ebony Nilsson from Australia, which is a sort of one from far, far away guest at the conference. She is a PhD candidate in the University of Sydney, where she works on her PhD dissertations about Jewish migrants and displaced persons in Australia from Europe and China. So her paper is titled A Pied Piper of Discontent Among Workers and Broken-Hearted Communists, the Transnational Lives and Politics of Polish-born Jews, left-wing activists in Australia.
Thank you. Sorry, I know that title is a bit of a mouthful. I'm going to take our discussion certainly a little bit further afield to Australia. Shortly after 1 a.m. on the 27th of August 1958, Jerzy, a Polish displaced person living in Sydney, was awakened by his barking dog, Pip. Suspecting an intruder, he went to investigate. After parting the curtains to peek out the front window, the glass shattered and a .38 caliber bullet ploughed into his living room wall. It whined past Jerzy at chest height, narrowly missing him, and he threw himself face down on the floor, expecting another shot. Jerzy was sure at the time that it had come from a tree 30 yards across the road and that a gunman or a gang was hunting him. Later, he was sure that the drive-by shooting was a warning from the Australian Workers' Union, his former employer, with whom he was having a rather messy split. Sure. Jerzy was one of approximately 170,000 displaced persons, or DPs, who arrived in Australia from Europe under the auspices of the International Refugee Organisation after the Second World War. The DPs were predominantly from Central and Eastern Europe and had a diverse range of stories. Some were Jewish concentration camp survivors, others voluntary or forced labourers for Nazi Germany, soldiers and civilians fleeing westward as the Red Army approached, and refugees from Soviet-occupied territory. Australia joined the ranks of nations accepting DPs in 1947, seeking to bolster its small population and to solve a post-war labour shortage, requiring the DPs to sign a 2-year indentured labour contract. Australia has a long history of racially restrictive immigration policy, which I can talk more about in question time. Its Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, known colloquially as the White Australia Policy, minimised non-British, non-white migration to Australia. DPs were seen as potentially assimilable white migrants, substitutes for the British and Scandinavian migrants whom they'd tried and failed to attract. This was Australia's first experiment with mass non-British migration, and it significantly altered the social and cultural demography of this settler colony. Alongside the White Australia policy was a systematic erasure of Australia's Indigenous population, leaving a general population who were very used to racial and cultural homogeneity, often with rampant xenophobia. The Australian government thus had to market or advertise these DPs as desirable white migrants who would assimilate quickly and become productive new Australians. And this is one such photo which they used to advertise these migrants to the Australian population, to show that they were very white and acceptable. I should note there too that officially the Australian policy was not to accept Jewish migrants amongst this group of refugees. However, in practice, several thousand Jewish migrants did arrive. This paper will examine Jerzy story to explore the diverse experiences of Polish Jewish left-wing activists who settled far outside their homeland in Australia. Through Jerzy's unusual life, which often fell between the boundaries of different communities, we see how diaspora communities formed along religious and political lines in Australia and were influenced by the emerging Cold War. Jerzy was born to Polish parents, both doctors in the Polish army. His relationship to his Jewish origins was complex. Jerzy's mother had been Jewish, but Jerzy only discovered this at the age of 15. Maria, who was born Miriam, had converted to Catholicism in order to marry Jerzy's highly nationalist and often very anti-Semitic father. Needless to say, that was not a very happy marriage. Jerzy admitted to himself being anti-Semitic in his younger years, influenced by his peers, and in the way that he saw all Poles were kind of anti-Semitic. By his own account, Jerzy had been politically active his whole life. He began medical training at the Warsaw Military Academy in 1938, only at his father's request, until the war began. With the German invasion of Poland, 18-year-old Jerzy, who is seen here, assisted his mother, sister and aunt in leaving Warsaw, fleeing toward the Soviet Union. He had been tasked with evacuating the Medical Academy's archives, but he disobeyed orders once he was outside the city, burning the documents and transporting his family instead. Jerzy's views on Soviet Russia were shaped by his aunt Helen, who was a prominent Warsaw socialist, whose credentials included running an organization for exiled revolutionaries and apparently being a very good friend of Lenin, although I've seen a number of people who were all apparently very good friends of Lenin. They settled in Lvov, where Jerzy was a member of the local Komsomol, apparently not from conviction, but, as he said later, just to be on the safest side. Between his strong public speaking and his fluent Russian, Jerzy appeared to have potential as a young agitator, and he generally found favour. He took up his medical studies again at the university. This ended, however, when his aunt and uncle were apparently caught up in a Khrushchev-led purge. His uncle was executed, and his aunt Helen was sent to Gulag. Jerzy subsequently moved his mother and his 10-year-old sister into hiding in a hospital warehouse. He seems to have enjoyed some of the adventure of this early period, belonging to a secret poets society and living off very little, but his aunt's imprisonment and death significantly darkened his opinion of Soviet communism. As the German army invaded the Soviet Union, Jerzy moved what was left of his family back to Poland. He hid his mother and sister on the family's country property and returned to Warsaw, where he was sworn into the Polish underground and began producing an illicit newspaper. However, Jerzy's life was shattered when a Gestapo-informing landowner denounced the family as Jews and collaborators with the resistance. All three were arrested. Jerzy's 12-year-old sister died of disease after a few years of imprisonment, and his mother was murdered, brutally, in front of him. Jerzy was then sent to Auschwitz alone. But this too, he survived. Able to conceal his relatively unknown Jewish origins, Jerzy was instead convicted of political hostility and quickly became involved in the Auschwitz underground, operating a clandestine radio and monitoring foreign broadcasts. He was evacuated in early 1945 as the Red Army bore down, and after a short time in Sachsenhausen, was forced into a death march toward the Black Sea, but was liberated by Americans on the way. Jerzy was initially resistant to becoming a displaced person. He'd just turned 24 when the war ended and travelled northern Germany for a few months seeking independence. Wandering into Hamburg, Jerzy was told by British authorities that he should be in a camp, but his response was, typically, "Never in my life." He did desire emigration, however, stating, "I didn't want to go back to communist Poland. I wanted to go out into the free world." He tried going to Bremerhaven, but they wouldn't let him board the American ships, so begrudgingly he entered a series of DP camps. Despite this reticence, Jerzy thrived. He was appointed an official camp leader by American authorities and began publishing a camp newspaper with the backing of the Polish Socialist Party, exiled in London. He also acted as the official party representative in Germany and established and ran no less than 2 DP trade unions. On top of these responsibilities, Jerzy testified at 8 of the Nuremberg trials, most notably those of Ernst Kaltenbrunner and Oswald Pohl. He testified to their knowledge of the final solution in action, having witnessed their visits to Auschwitz, and Jerzy's pride in his testimony and the role that it played in their convictions was enduring. Amid all this, he apparently still found time to hunt former Gestapo officers with the American Army, and perhaps also worked for American intelligence, but I'm still trying to establish whether there's any truth in that one. Though Jerzy later said that this flurry of activity was an exceptional time, which exhausted his anger and his desire for revenge against the Germans, it perhaps foreshadowed his future interactions with other Europeans and with intelligence officers. And indeed, in unionising DPs, it seems that the taste of this work determined his destiny. Jerzy was sponsored for migration to the United States by a New York Jewish organisation, and employment was arranged for him as the editor of a Polish socialist newspaper. But the organisation and its plans fell victim to Senator McCarthy. Jerzy felt that his trade union activity and political associations made him a potential suspect during the early Cold War, though he staunchly maintained into his old age that he was the correct kind of socialist, not the left-wing kind who collaborated with communists. In seeking an alternative for resettlement, he settled upon Australia, saying that, quote, "It's warmer, it has a friendly government, a socialist Labour Party government." So, he boarded a ship in 1949, disembarking in Sydney, unfortunately just 3 days after that Labour government had lost power. Jerzy began life as a full-time trade union man not too long after his arrival in Australia. He worked a number of jobs as part of his 2-year indentured labour contract, from hospital orderly to crematorium assistant. Then, in the early 1950s, the Australian Workers' Union, which was a conservative, anti-communist industrial union, had settled upon hiring a migrant organiser to recruit members of the new DP workers, who now formed a significant part of Australia's industries. Most Australian trade unions, including the AWU, had initially opposed the DP migration scheme, concerned about possible post-war employment shortages, and a belief that all DPs were staunchly anti-union. Some certainly were, believing the unions were controlled by communists. But, as became apparent, some DPs were receptive to union politics and represented a mass of potential new members. The AWU approached the International Federation of Free Trade Unions, who suggested Jerzy, with his prior experience unionising the European DP camps. 30-year-old Jerzy accepted the role in 1951, and after apparently qualifying on the bloody noses of a bunch of communists, began a tumultuous decade as an AWU organiser. Jerzy visited industrial sites with large numbers of migrant workers and wrote for the AWU Journal. So here we see a number of migrant workers on a large hydroelectric industrial scheme. His articles in multiple languages explained Australian industrial law to migrants, and while visiting work sites, he acted as an interpreter, translated migrants' qualification documents, and assisted them in integrating into the union. Jerzy encouraged workers to write to him in English, Polish, German, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Czech, Slovak, Italian, Slovenian, Hungarian, Bulgarian, or French. He seems to have been fairly successful in recruiting migrant workers. Much of his appeal lay in his ability with languages. Being able to speak and to write to migrants in various familiar languages gave him currency in an industrial and social environment where migrants were expected to communicate in English exclusively and immediately. Essentially, no material was ever provided to migrant workers in languages other than English. So Yerji's explanations of Australian industrial law and practices were understandably popular among them. His linguistic abilities were not welcomed by AWU officials, however, with many harbouring xenophobic fears of foreigners. Some saw Yerji's efforts as anti-assimilationist, inhibiting migrants' ability to learn English and encouraging their segregation from Australian-born workers. This was ridiculous to Yerji's strongly assimilationist and pan-migrant sensibilities, and he continued unabated. But these tensions saw him dismissed from the AWU with a series of lawsuits. Yerji would not be beaten, however. Having survived both the legal action and the drive-by shooting, which I mentioned at the beginning, he promptly established his own trade union, exclusively for migrants, the New Citizens Council, or NCC. The NCC was a pan-migrant organisation run with Yerji's Greek partner, Solon. Between them, Yerji felt that they covered all backgrounds. Solon looked after the Southern and Central Europeans, and Yerji the Northern and Eastern Europeans. Their subscription rate was low, just £1 per year, and they provided information in many languages, translation of migrant workers' documents, assistance with repatriation, and legal services. With the NCC, Yerji claimed that migrants did have their own needs in the workplace, as distinct from Australian-born workers. He saw that Australian trade unions did not cater to migrants in familiar languages and failed to assist them in acculturating and integrating into Australian workplaces. The local Polish community, however, had mixed feelings about Yerji's trade union work. Some were, as the union supposed, vehemently anti-communist and believed that associating with unionists was, by definition, to collaborate with communism. Some perceived that Yerji's assimilationist rhetoric, cosmopolitanism, and work on behalf of all migrants threatened the survival of their nationally based community as Poles. Yerji had long-running feuds with a number of prominent members of Australia's Polish community, particularly the editors of Polish-language newspapers, who often published articles which were critical of Yerji's union work and his business connections with the Polish consulate in Sydney. Many of these migrants also took their concerns to ASIO, which was Australia's domestic intelligence agency, equivalent essentially to Britain's MI5. And they frequently denounced Yerji as a communist. Yerji, too, became a keen informer, reporting migrants he felt were a threat to Australia and developing a sustained relationship with ASIO. Though some of these reports were born of a genuine Cold War concern regarding left-wing activists and communism, some migrants saw an opportunity to exact revenge for a perceived slight or conflict, and Yerji's ASIO file is frequently more revealing of everyday community antagonisms rather than actual political conflicts. So we have a few of the general responses to Yerji's new migrant trade union across a number of different papers. It was felt that this was a racist party, as only migrants were allowed to join, and that it was going to create union splitting within industries. Apart from personal grievances, one repeatedly sees anti-Semitism embedded in denunciations of Yerji. Despite being a professed atheist, having lost faith in all religions during the war, another reason why he attracted the ire of the strongly Catholic Polish community, Yerji was labelled as Jewish by several migrant informants. Nor did his lack of connection to his Jewish origins and the broadish Jewish community prevent this. ASIO recorded one source conveying, quote, strong rumours that Yerji is really a Jew who formerly had a Jewish name. He claims to have been active in the Polish underground army during the occupation, but none of the many members now in Sydney ever knew him. False identities were a common basis for denunciation, and though many DPs did, indeed, alter their names, religions and nationalities, Yerji does not appear to have done so at any point. Similarly, another informant alleged that though Yerji claimed to have been in Auschwitz, other survivors of the camp did not mention or remember him. ASIO seemed to have taken this critique of Yerji's story seriously, but in the 23 years that they had him under surveillance, never noted that he did indeed bear the characteristic tattoo on his forearm. Jerzy did associate with a few prominent members of the Jewish community in Sydney, mostly through his involvement on an immigration advisory council for the Labour Party. Sydney had a thriving Jewish community, present before this wave of migration, and revitalised through it as well. And though its leftist groups began to split in the mid-1950s over emerging evidence of Soviet anti-Semitism, pro-Soviet groups existed, and many started to move towards the anti-communist left, becoming these so-called broken-hearted communists. Though their politics were certainly similar to Jerzy's, he avoided this Jewish scene. He later stated that he had never thought of himself as Jewish, and so had never fitted into the Jewish community in Sydney. Indeed, the Jewish press too joined in the fray when the New South Wales Trades Council denounced Jerzy's New Citizens Council, decrying it as union-splitting activity. Jerzy claimed that the New Citizens Council had between 5,000 and 6,000 subscribers at its height, and it does seem that many migrants visited the NCC for its services. One Sydney paper reported that, quote, every time Jerzy gets adverse publicity in the newspapers, the queue of supplicant migrants outside his office evaporates. Then, a few days later, they are back there, 40 at a time, waiting to see the man who understands them. Though Jerzy was educated, wrote poetry, and really fancied himself as a literary man, he related most effectively not with other middle-class migrants, but with working-class migrants, particularly manual and industrial workers. He wanted to champion their rights as workers and citizens, integrating them into the community as new Australians. Jerzy's position as a migrant unionist placed him within disparate communities. He was the site at which several communities coalesced, where migrants engaged with union politics, and Australian unions were forced to accommodate an actual migrant. As a result, Jerzy was frequently at the centre of conflict and fell between the gaps of the various communities, never fitting easily into any of them. To the Australian unions, he remained a migrant, a foreigner, his thick accent and ability with languages often the subject of suspicion. To many migrants, particularly the Polish community, he was often too cosmopolitan, and his efforts to unionise and assist all migrants, uniting them as new Australians, appeared communist, Jewish, and generally dangerous, as well as betraying his Polish roots. To ASIO, and we see some of their surveillance photos of Jerzy here, Jerzy was a well-connected anti-communist, and he was a keen informer, but he remained a migrant trade unionist who cultivated business connections with Polish consular officials. As a Pied Piper of discontent among manual worker new Australians, he was still a potential threat. Jerzy's life was a chain of odd, often conflicting connections and identities, held together by the coherent theme of left-wing labour activism, an organisation on behalf of migrant and displaced workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And right now I would like to welcome the last presenter, Professor Daniel Walkowitz from the New York University, who is a significant social and cultural historian, the author of dozens of books and dozens of articles. He's also involved in public history, pioneering in public television effort to bring the past to a broader general audience. The title of his presentation is the Bund, Milieu, the Polish Jewish left-wing diaspora from Łódź and Białystok to Paterson, New Jersey. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a delight to be back both in Poland and in Poland. This project is a bit autobiographical. I'm an Autokacher here in this among these others, and it's partially draws on a lot of oral histories with family members, among others. It also draws on a book that I published last year, which is called The Remembered and Forgotten Jewish World, in which I go to 13 cities to look at Jewish heritage in particular for stories of my paternal grandmother, in whose footsteps I always imagined myself as an activist walking. So it resonates in part with a third or second generation of Jews who's traced their origins back to Poland. Reminiscing in 1990, Martha Stone Asher, who's the young girl with the hair with a bow tie on the right-hand side, noted, "My father," who's the man on the left, came from Białystok, Poland, and his social outlook influenced me, especially my older sister Eve and myself. And Eve is the woman on the left. From our earliest youth. Julius Stone, she explained, her father, was a socialist before he came to the country at the age of 19 in 1990. He had been active in the Bund, a Jewish organization that, as she characterized it, had pro-labor and some socialist ideals. Drawing on this background, both Martha and her older sister Eve would go on to join the American Communist Party, and Martha, as chair of the New Jersey division of the CPUSA, would become a leading figure in the left-wing Jewish radical community of the Passaic region, Textile Valley. So you can see where the Passaic region is. That's where Paterson is located. You can see it in relationship to New York. And that's the region itself. We can come back to the Bund foundational narrative that Stone recounted was not unique. Historical accounts of Jewish women who led kosher meat riots, rent strikes, and labor protests in the opening 2 decades of the 20th century in New York City typically referenced their background in the Bund. And when a newly married Stone settled in Paterson in 1942 with her husband Emil Asher, we'll talk about later, she entered a community of like-minded radicals who told a similar origin story. Notably among that Bund community were my paternal grandparents, here in the middle, Chaya Lubertowski and Zisha Walkowitz, their activist children, and an extended Walkowitz-Lubertowski family network. The man sitting on my left is my Uncle Joe Katz, who I'll talk about a bit. My grandfather is seated on the right. In front of him is my father, and seated on his left is my Uncle Joe. You'll get the idea. Mishprocha. As a radical activist in the 1960s, their eldest son and my father, Saul, regularly regaled me with stories, at once proud and amusing, of my Bundist grandparents. Now, the historian Frank Wolf has powerfully described core elements of the Bundist revolutionary Yiddishkeit, secular socialist culture, rather than Zionism, and the third part he calls Mishpochkeit, or the local neighborhoods of solidarity. In this essay, I try to examine how women such as Martha and Chaya and other Paterson men and women, like Joe Katz and my grandfather Zisha, and their neighbors embraced this background, but drew upon this legacy and nonetheless gave rather complicated stories to these core elements. So Paterson, New Jersey, is a major industrial city located about 10 miles west of New York City, and it serves as a case study of the immigrant Bund milieu in the United States. The Silk City, as it was called, the Lyon of America, was an appropriate destination for Jewish textile workers, immigrants from Łódź, the Manchester of Poland, and from Białystok, a city that also had a well-developed textile industry. By 1910, Paterson, with a population of about 125,000, provided work to over 5,000 silk workers and thousands more in various textile and garment trades, such as tailoring, which was my grandfather Zisha's craft. The story of Paterson Bundist immigrants, which in the late 1920s will include the experience of Julius's daughter Martha, begins, however, with others. Julius, in fact, settled in Brooklyn. Drawing on oral reminiscences, oral histories, and genealogical records, this account focuses initially on 3 activist members of the Lubertowski family, my great-uncle Joseph Katz, and my paternal grandparents, Joe's brother-in-law Zisha and Chaya Walkowitz. Now, Joe Katz was born in Zyskowicz, Poland, a small town about 85 miles northwest of Lublin. And he was born presciently on May 1st, now May Day, but in 1878. The turn of the century finds Joe, a firebrand organizer, committed to the revolutionary politics of the Bund in Łódź. Work in the Łódź textile industry promised a better life for a weaver like Joe. Long hours, however, with meager pay in the mills or sweated labor in shops, frustrated ambition. No mention of Joe appears in Pavel Sejmus's account of the Bund insurrection. Joe was, in fact, simply a foot soldier, one of the many rank-and-file activists that make up a social movement. In any case, manufacturers knew him well and blacklisted him, and at the risk of being arrested by police, a circle of revolutionary brethren secreted him through an underground network out of Poland in late 1908. His wife, Neche, née Lubertowski, who's also there in the center, in the second row, and his daughter would join him in Paterson a year later. She was pregnant at the time and couldn't come immediately. There was no Bund, to be sure, in Paterson, but Bundism shaped Joe's immediate and subsequent life. Joe joined the famous silk workers' strike in Paterson in 1913, and gaining the enmity of the bosses, was again blacklisted from the local textile industry. Joe's banishment, however, had an ironic result. Unable to work in the mills among the labor proletariat, Joe became a petty bourgeois shopkeeper, a role he deeply resented, and he opening a small delicatessen on Carroll Street in the middle of the immigrant Jewish neighborhood. In 1920, he used his good fortune to bring some relatives and old comrades to Paterson, my family. The young Walkowitz couple had joined the Katzes in Łódź in 1908 or thereabouts. The records, again, are scant. In the tightly knit Baluti community, they shared bread, grievances, and a vision of a socialist life fueled by Bund and Yiddish political culture. Zisha fought alongside Joe and ultimately suffered a similar fate, the blacklist. Now, neither Zisha or Chaya appear in historical accounts of those days either, but stories of them as Bundists, again, were proudly told to grandchildren, like myself, as models for our social activism. Both were wedded to a socialist cause embedded in Yiddish political culture. As revolutionaries, Zisha, Chaya, and Joe took on these core elements of Bundist political culture, rejecting both the orthodoxy in which they were raised and Zionist alternatives. They were militantly socialist, secular socialist internationalists, and as political radicals, they wielded Yiddishkeit, poetry, song, and Zisha's particular passion, theater, in service of the building of a revolutionary working class. Tailors and weavers by trade, in their heart, they were cultural workers for whom Yiddishkeit was a vehicle through which they could reach the Jewish proletariat. Reuniting in Paterson in 1920, the Katz and Walkowitz families became part, however, of an extensive support network of familiar refugees from Łódź that included friends, neighbors, and relatives, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. Others settled in Paterson Chaya settled in Paterson near her sister Neche and her 3 daughters. And the Katz and Walkowitz families quickly, however, found themselves embroiled in an arcane ideological dispute that came to divide former Bund comrades. Since departing revolutionary Łódź, the Russian Revolution had divided loyalties. The differences mirrored sectarian disputes and divisions that, of course, have famously divided Bundists in the wake of Lenin's rise to power. Some left-wing militants formed the Communist Party and aligned with the Soviet Union as a model for moving forward. Self-professed moderates opposed what they saw as abridged civil liberties of communist centralism and supported instead democratic socialism. A socialist labor activist, Joe Katz, considered the strategies, for instance, policies, and what he saw as the dogmatism of the communists, my parents and grandparents, to be rigid and anathema. Differences, thus, between the families and how they were bridged illustrate the complexity and vitality of Jewish Bundism, a legacy they both spoke of, and of complexity of Jewish family life. They had fought alongside one another in Łódź and shared opposition to the hated capitalists. But in Paterson, post-war Paterson, they could barely tolerate being in the same room with one another when discussions turned to politics. Socialists and communists each insisted that they were the real radicals and that the others were either soft or reckless. So there were, in fact, two Jewish Bundist-inflected community centers. Socialists like the Katzes read the Yiddish forward, and their children went to the Arbeiter Ring or Workmen's Circle schools to learn Yiddish, and in the summer to Camp Kinderring on Sylvan Lake, 60 miles north of New York City. Communists read the Yiddish Morgen Freiheit, and their youth, like the Walkowitz children, went to communist-affiliated Volksschule on Sunday and to Camp Kinderlund, organized by the International Workers' Order, across the lake from Camp Kinderring. The two camps never would speak to one another. Bitter enemies, they never socialized. Still, while democratic socialism and democratic centralism did not easily fit together, Bund culture, Yiddishkeit, socialism, again not Zionism, and the bonds of community for solidarity remained touchstones for Jewish left-wing daily life on both sides of the ideological divide. The Walkowitz family, for example, was renowned in the community as a center for local culture, for that culture. Locals knew the Walkowitz family house to be a ready refuge for visiting artists, poets, and actors. In his oral history, my Uncle Joe recalled never knowing whom he would wake up to next to him in his bed. A centerpiece of this revolutionary Yiddish culture was the Paterson Jewish Freiheitgesangverein, later the Paterson Jewish Folk Chorus, a 70-voice left-wing Yiddish chorus, 1923 until the mid-1970s, that actually evolved from a workers' chorus that organized in 1914 in the wake of the Silk Strike. Firmly, as was described, in the cultural orbit of the American Communist Party for half of its 60 years, it rehearsed in the IWO Hall, Workers' Hall, International Workers' Hall. Zisha served as its president during the interwar years, and after his untimely death in 1943, his daughter and son, Belle and Joe, assumed the mantle in turn. For workers such as Zisha, the chorus was not a vacation from the labor struggles. Rather, along with literary clubs, concerts, poetry readings, and theater, the chorus for them was a weapon in a robust cultural arsenal with which radical Jews mobilized on behalf of the Paterson workers' struggles for dignity and rights. Family life both sustained and impeded activism and solidarities of Jewish radicals such as Zisha and Chaya. For 30 years in Paterson, Chaya, like many women in support of community actions, did fundraising and support work for union struggles, for Yiddish Schulen, and for the folk chorus, and they made a welcome home for the constant stream of visitors who brought Yiddish and radical culture to the city. Responding to a subpoena from the Un-American Affairs Committee, which was probably the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, her final words to inquisitors, as related by her son Joe, who translated her Yiddish for her, illustrates her spunk, her principles, and the toughness that animated women such as Chaya. As she said to Joe, "You can tell these gentlemen that they can go home and sleep tonight. They don't have to worry. I'm not going to throw any bombs." The legacy of the Bund experience extended from Zisha and Chaya. That's the Łódź home. There we are in Paterson. That's the Paterson working class neighborhood, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. But first I'll go to here. The story of the Bund experience extended from Zisha and Chaya to three of their children, Belle, Sol, and Joe. Rose, that's the person next to my Uncle Joe on the right, the woman on the right, was a distinct apolitical presence among her actually quite vocal siblings. I think in order to get her own voice, she had to take on a very different kind of political identity. The three other children, however, all became active in the Paterson Communist Party and the Yiddish cultural apparatus that supported it. My sense is that Bund identity shared a psychic space with the identity of as communists, and they were hard to disentangle. While Bundists often trace their heritage in the U.S. to the Arbiter Ring and socialism, the extended Walkowitz family history illustrates how Jewish communists claim that tradition as well. The CP tie, however, also brings us back to the Martha Stone family with which we began. The Stone family story exposes yet another set of transformations and oppositions within the Bundist milieu. Following the 1926 Passaic strike, that's where Martha Stone first cut her teeth. I can note my father was 11 at the time, and he spoke there as the head of the Young Pioneers. They didn't know one another then. Martha Stone after the strike, lived and worked in the Passaic Textile Valley as an organizer for the Communist Party. The CPUSA recognized her to be a person of unusual ability, and she rose quickly within party ranks, becoming chair of the New Jersey branch of the party in the mid-1930s. As a leader, she visited the Soviet Union as an American representative to the party in 1931 and 1935, gaining some notoriety, or acclaim, if you wish, for pressing the Comintern on women's issues. In New Jersey, she helped organizing drives and strikes in 1926, 1928, 1931, and 1933 for Passaic Valley silk and dye workers. She played a leading role in campaigns for day nurseries for working mothers in rent strikes on behalf of public employees' unemployment benefits, and in the post-war era helped pioneer struggles for, called then, Negro rights and civil liberties laws and the anti-nuclear armaments campaign. The outbreak of war finds Martha in Paterson boarding with a young Polish couple at 29 Water Street in the middle of the Jewish immigrant neighborhood. Employed as a receptionist in a doctor's office, her full-time passion is the work of the party. Neighborhood associations echo Wolf's Klaverschaft or Mischpokeit, the familial network that sustains political activism in a socialist world. Jewish Polish radicals like the Ashers, Lubertavskis, and Walkowitzes live within a quarter mile of one another. You get a sense of where they all live right near one another. In 1941, Asher marries a communist dye worker from Paterson, Emil Asher. So she's Martha Stone, then she becomes Martha Stone Asher. Born in the city in 1915, Emil's father was a junk dealer and had immigrated from Poland to Paterson. In 1940, Emil's parents live at 16 Carroll Street, a 2-minute walk from Zisha and Chaya's home, that's the Star, around the corner at 177 Fulton Street. A 5-minute walk away was Chaya's sister, Necha, and she lived there with Joe Katz and their 3 daughters, etc. The 4 Walkowitz children all settled nearby. You don't need to get the details. You get a sense of that from the picture. This is, again, Eva Stone. In sum, Martha and Emil Asher, Zisha and Chaya Walkowitz, Joe and Necha Katz, and the 4 Walkowitz children were integral parts of a coherent Yiddish-speaking, working-class Paterson neighborhood. Yiddish was the language of the streets, though the younger generation spoke English as well. Radical Yiddish institutions like the Chorus and the IWO Hall served as cultural and political foci for this culture. Moreover, Paterson's Bund milieu sustained a supportive, protective neighborhood committed to a radical vision of social justice. By the 1940s, the Bund as a political institution had long receded from their lives, but the values, cultural institutions, and networks that constituted the Bund milieu continue to animate the lives of Paterson radicals, both socialists and communists. Yet, Bundist solidarities could not bridge fundamental fissures among Polish Jewish leftists such as those between Joe Katz and Zisha Walkowitz over how they would in fact achieve the Bundist socialist world. One final wrinkle to Martha Stone's family story further illustrates the diverse and at times conflicted meanings of the Bundist legacy. In 1926, Martha's older sister Eve marries Alex Bale. Eve is a strike organizer. Bale is a Russian clerk who boarded with her family. Bale was already an early and leading member of the CPUSA. He'd been arrested in 1922 at the age of 22 for attending the underground second meeting of the party in Bridgeton, Michigan. But by the end of 1927, he had risen to become district organizer for the party's Boston Center. And Eve joined him in the party and in their dramatic split from it. In 1929, both become core members of the right-wing Communist Party, the majority opposition, Lovestonites. Adopting the party name George Miles, Frank becomes a member of the group's National Council, and in the late 1930s goes to Detroit as head of the Lovestones' effort to defeat the communist leadership of the United Auto Workers. His wife Eve, now going under the name of Eve Smith, is his lifelong partner in the effort by the Lovestonites to build an anti-communist, centrist labor movement. Like her sister, Martha, Eve could claim her father's Bundism as a legacy, and initially also took that tradition into the CPUSA, but her subsequent political trajectory demonstrates the diverse paths into which that tradition could evolve. Joe Katz, we've seen, identified with the socialists. Zisha and Chaim Walkowitz joined the CPUSA. Eve, with Alex, became fervently anti-communist in the CP opposition. After World War II, as McCarthyism began to ensnare communist leaders such as Martha, who goes underground, her contact while she's underground is my father, Eve and Alex annually hosted FBI agents who checked in on them personally for news of Martha. In fact, the Bale and Asher families had become bitter political enemies who sustained a détente only in family get-togethers. In sum, while Frank Wolf's core elements for Bundism remain useful categories, profound political differences between former comrades make clear how Yiddishkeit and even Mishpacholit, the sense of family and community organization, requires not a narrow but a rather multiplicity in its definitions, these categories. All draw upon Yiddishkeit, remaining secular, and very broadly socialist and social democrats with many common goals. Yet they have fundamentally different visions of how to achieve social justice and that severely tested solidarities. They also disagreed to the point of barely speaking with one another. The Bund, thus, could be invoked and idealized, even as it held fractured meanings for mid-century Jewish Polish activists in America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have 3/4 to discuss the papers. If you have some questions or commentaries, please, I will go to give you microphone.
Thank you so much for these papers. It was a really fascinating panel. And I have a quick comment and then a question for the whole panel. My comment is for Ebony. Oh, sorry, I'm David Sluky from the College of Charleston. Ebony, that was great, and what you're doing is really terrific. In just speaking from the perspective of Australian Jewish history, I thought, my initial thought was writing about a Polish Jew in Sydney is already interesting because it rubs against the grain of that cliche of Polish Jews in Melbourne and Yekkers in Sydney. And I think that's great. And then also about a sort of non-Yiddishy Polish Jew particularly, like this is just a story that has, as far as I can tell, not been told in Australia. So thank you for that. I think that's really important. My question for the panel is a methodological question. And it's just thinking about the different kinds of sources and how do we bridge these different sources. So I was thinking, Zoe, about the comment you made that you only have leaders that you can really trace their history. And this is like a problem with archival research, right? Because we don't have traces in organizational records of like schleppers and rank and file. So I was thinking, is there a way that we can sort of use Daniel's methodology with the, and sort of combine these together to try and trace other kinds of people within these movements?
Mariusz Kałczewiak, University of Potsdam. I have a question to Ebony. Now it's better? Or? Okay, now you hear him. Okay, yeah. Again, Mariusz Kałczewiak, University of Potsdam. Question to Ebony. You showed this very nice photo picturing, the new immigrants arriving to Australia, and you said that it was kind of like advertising the immigrants for the non-Jewish and non-immigrant Australian public. And can you tell us if at all in Australian immigration policy concerning the Holocaust survivors, the political views of these immigrants were anyhow an issue? If the immigrants needed to kind of like wiped out the left-wing political engagement, if I don't know, socialist Jews or like former socialist Jews were considered kind of a danger for Australia, kind of revolutionary power that was supposed to to introduce certain social tension to Australia. And the question to Zoe, you say that many of your subjects before becoming communists, they were active in Ashomera Tzair or other or Bundism. So do you have like already an explanation or like how your subjects explain the move from being a Jewish left-winger involved in a clearly Jewish socialist politics into becoming communists?
Eva Herbst. I live in Edgewater, New Jersey, just next to Paterson, 15 minutes away. So for me it was fascinating. I had no idea about that Polish-Jewish history there. So my question is, I understand that a lot of immigrants came from Łódź because it was natural. How did it look outside of Paterson? The spread of the movement, the ideas in other areas, say in New Jersey, or how did it work from starting from Paterson?
Let's make the first round of answers, and then the second round will be open. Yes, so right now you have.
Okay, I might. It's on? Hello. Okay. I'll answer that direct question first. So in terms of the political views of these refugees and what Australian immigration policy is doing there, absolutely, they're very concerned about the possibility of left-wing ideas and movements being transplanted into Australia as a result of this migration. And the screening that takes place in Europe before these people are allowed to immigrate is essentially designed to root out anyone who might be slightly left-wing. To the extent that, and there's been quite a bit of work done on this, that a whole bunch of fascist war criminals actually make their way into Australia because that's preferable to left-wing people because they're very anti-communist and will just ignore their war crimes if they'll come here and be anti-communist. That said, my whole dissertation is working on people who did arrive with those views. So, I mean, obviously you knew as you came through screening that you wouldn't be open about your left-wing views, and you would try to expunge that from your past as much as you could, and a whole lot of people were very successful in doing that, obviously, because they made it to Australia and then did exactly what the government didn't want them to do and became involved in left-wing politics. In terms of methodology, it's a really good question, and I think I'm still grappling with that. I have one of the other individuals I'm looking at who's not Polish or Jewish at all, he's Latvian. He's very much that working class, really not very educated at all, but gets involved with the trade unions when he gets to Australia, and he's very difficult to trace as a result, but I think he's particularly interesting because of that. So the way I've been able to get to him is with these intelligence files, and they're not perfect. Obviously, surveillance is really difficult to work with as a source, but it gives me some view of those people, and then I'm trying to supplement that with whatever else I can add to it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, about like finding other activists. The problem for my peers is that most of these activists are dead, but their children are not. The problem is they usually don't have a lot of documents or, you know, even information on the parents. So at first I was like, okay, I'm going to integrate them and to find names through the children. But if I wanted to be able to really follow them, to rely on sources that were kind of the same, I chose to stay with like the leaders, and maybe later I could change. But I'm going to compare the, you know, the profile of these leaders with others through these interviews I got with children of rank and file. Yeah. And so about Jewish leftists who are not communist at first, it's only a minority of my group. And usually they were in the youth group of Hashomer HaTzair or Bund in Poland, and they decided to leave Poland. And when they arrived in Belgium or France, the Bund was really not like developed, and Hashomer HaTzair same, and the communists were much more important. And at that time, usually they were in migrant communities, and they joined in the factories, for instance, the Communist Party, because they were still unsure, they were young. And at that time, they were kind of, they don't really explain it, actually. It's usually in their biographical file at the French Communist Party, so they had to explain where they came from in terms of political party. So they're like, yeah, it was a youth choice, but then I came to the Communist Party because it's the best choice for me, but they don't really, and in their biography or memoirs, they usually don't really mention it either because they want to be seen as communist. So yeah, I have to maybe dig this question.
The question of Paterson typicality is an fairly easy one to answer. Up until World War II, Jewish settlement in the United States is urban, not suburban. And urban centers, we're talking in New Jersey primarily about Newark and Paterson, Passaic. And the story is pretty much the same, not going to be very different. And it's certainly a story that echoes in places like New York City. And I think if you were to go to most of the other large centers like Cleveland and elsewhere, I think you'd find a lot of the same divisions racking people. I haven't looked at those places. I know enough about New York, where I've trained most of the people who do this sort of stuff, so I have a sense of it. Sources, of course, oral histories is the way to do this. The problem, of course, is how to do it and how to find the people. I accept a couple of things. One is to find one and then use rather conventional snowball interviewing techniques, ask them for names of people that they know. In terms of Paris, I would go and talk. I was just in Paris, and I know Francois de Croo is still around. I don't know if Patrick Friedenson still is, but there are certainly people who have been left-wing both Jews and people who have been studying Jewish activists for a long time, who could put you in touch with people. The traditional place I would go are retirement communities, where I would make contact with the homes and facilities. I've lectured there. These people are very anxious to speak and to tell their story and to talk, and they're a wonderful source for opening up. If you were in a place like Amsterdam, Sommerleyersdorf would be a comparable kind of person, and there are people in all of these places that can put you in touch, it seems to me, with opening this up. I'm just going to add one other piece that's interesting to me here that I didn't talk about. Of course, in the United States, most people leave the Communist Party by 1956. There are very few people who are still in the party. My father was always a party person. It just became the Democratic Party. So he was the left wing of the peace activists in Bergen County as a kind of, and you see some of that now in what's in the Bernie movement, and Sanders, who is both seen to be a figure coming out of the 30s and New Deal political culture, and sees those echoes. So YIVO, just about now 2 months ago, held a conference, a one-day conference on the Bund today. It was to standing room only. People who wanted to talk about the echoes of Bundism, which was largely, I would say, romanticized, but nonetheless something they saw as a tradition that was informing at least the kind of contemporary political anti-populist movement in the United States. So Bundism as a movement, whatever it all means, still seems to resonate with a third and fourth generation of people who are trying to imagine what that was like and can still be like.
Thank you. My name is Anna Nedlin-Lehrer. I'm from the University of Freiburg, and I have a question for Zoe. Thank you very much for all papers, but I want to ask you regarding the issue that you touched upon, the gender issue. You said, or I think you described the phenomenon that we see in a lot of leftist organizations, that we have female activists who are very who try to be as active and also in the same spheres as men, but then somehow when this period, and in your case the war period, when it ends, like the period of main activism, they somehow return to their classic roles as husbands and mothers. And I wanted to ask you if you could find anything in your sources how women dealt with this, if this was actually an issue for them, if they saw it as a anti-feminist, as not even anti-feminist. Also, I mean, it's when talking about communism, we're talking about the idea of an egalitarian society, and this is actually against the ideology that always the men and the couples get to be activists while the women have to return to the home. So do you have any explanation why this happened? And also, do you have did you find anything how women explained it to themselves? I assume they remained communists. So how does it work if you believe in an ideology that promotes egalitarian society, but on the other hand, you actually don't live in an egalitarian society?
Jan Kaczalski, nauczyciel Warszawa. Ja po polsku chciałem zadać pytanie do pani Grumberg. Wspomniała pani, że... Tak? Już. Tak, można? A, już można, tak? Tak, już można?
Yitzhak Schwartz, also from New York University. And my question is sort of building off yours, which is, in the case of the research I'll be presenting here, my research is in the 19th century. So there's, I couldn't find anyone who had direct experience of the communities I was trying to learn about who was living. And I found a few people who had secondhand experience, and most of what they had to say wasn't very, detailed or, particularly interesting, actually. But I did find some oral histories. I found some memoirs. Now, memoirs that are saved and preserved, all the memoirs I found were written by men. One of them was written by a woman, but it was mostly about her father. And I know, based on organizational records, that there were women who were more involved in the communities, in the leadership in the communities. There was just so little that I could find. I wonder if I guess that echoes the issues that that Zoe spoke about, and issues that I know Professor Walkowitz's work deals with. I wonder, if that squares with your experiences and how you've managed to overcome that.
Jeszcze raz, Jan Kaczalski, Warszawa, nauczyciel. Wspomniała Pani, że po 1945 roku część osób, właściwie pytanie jaka część, jaka liczba, czy można w ogóle ją określić, przyjeżdża do Warszawy i przebywa tutaj, do Polski, i przebywa tutaj do 1968 roku, po 1968 roku, po tych haniebnych wydarzeniach, które tu miały miejsce, z powrotem wraca do Francji, do Paryża. Pytanie pierwsze, czy można określić, jaka to była liczba? Jacy to byli ludzie, którzy tu z Paryża, z Francji przyjeżdżają do Warszawy? W jakie życie, czy kulturalne, czy polityczne tutaj w Warszawie się włączają, są aktywni, czy można też to określić? I jaka część ludzi po 1968 roku jednak decyduje się w tych innych warunkach pozostać tu w Warszawie, czy już całkowicie wychodząc z działalności kulturalnej czy politycznej, a ci, którzy wyjechali z powrotem do Paryża. Dobrze, to dziękuję, to na razie tyle.
Thank you. Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska, University of Warsaw. So my question is also somehow to the whole panel, and I was provoked somehow by the title of the panel, as I would like to ask about transnational dimension of the activism that you have discussed. So what I would be very interested in is whether your activists or politicians maintained contacts with their cities of origin, as Łódź or Białystok or the other cities that they were from, and also whether the ideas, like political ideas that they transferred somehow from Poland to the US or to Australia or to France, whether they were Americanized or somehow adopted to the local conditions, right? So Australian conditions or French conditions. And here again, I think like this issue of gender is kind of striking. That at least like to my knowledge, I'm not like a specialist on the topic, but as far as I know, like this activism wasn't as vivid in Poland as it was in the countries that you've discussed. Thank you.
Two questions I'll address. First is gender. Worth noting that two of the most important books in the last decade in the United States on the Bund are both deeply gendered analyses, Daniel Katz and Tony Michael's works, in emphasizing the role of women in trying to capture a story that largely has not been told in terms of gendered before. So there is, I think, the place of second and third generation feminists, it seems to me, has begun to have its impact in the transformation of the kinds of things that are done. I'm a very big fan, for instance, of this museum, and I think one of the things it doesn't do is gender very well. I think it does everything else extremely well, but I don't think it does gender particularly well here, and I've told that to my colleague, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet, and but it was the one thing, my wife, who's quite a distinguished feminist scholar, was the first thing that she felt when she went through here. So that's a problem. An anecdote, briefly to illustrate the problem, however, is when I was in Krakow, I was getting ready to go out for the day to do my touring of heritage tourism, and I heard a voice in the distance at the breakfast line that I can only describe as Brooklyn. In other words, I heard somebody with an accent. It was clearly an American from the United States. And I said, Landsman, how are you? He says, oh, so what are you doing here? So I laughingly said, well, I'm studying you. I'm studying Jewish tourists doing heritage tourism. He says, oh, I'm not Jewish. I converted and became a Baptist 2 years ago. As if somehow you can change your religion, you can then change your culture. And you can't, not so easily. And that's the same thing. So my father, who was a mother who were both communists, my father always had trouble with my sister as an activist not wearing a bra because in the 1960s. That's to say there were elements, you can transform your politics, you can't always transform your culture entirely. Patriarchy has long roots in these cultures, and even longer roots in Eastern and Central Europe than in the United States. The question of transnationalism, the cultures are different. So first wave and second wave feminism had much greater impact in the United States than it did in Central and Eastern Europe. And that has only begun to have an impact in the last 10 years in this part of the world. The transnational, thus, is a big issue. I would say worth noting that these people were all internationalists, but they were not necessarily, it's a question that was asked, you raised it in discussion of your paper briefly, and the organizers asked about it. How Polish were these people, and what did Poland mean for them? And I was struck by the fact that my family never identified themselves really as Polish. We came from Poland, and when I first came here and people said to me, oh, are you Polish? I was a little, well, I was Jewish. I wasn't. I've come to understand that differently now, having been here 6 or 7 times over 30 years. But certainly when I'm in the United States and I talk to people and I say, well, I've just been to Berlin to do research, or I've been to here, they say, why would you go to those places? They're just full of anti-Semites. And I'd say, well, you want to meet anti-Semites? Go talk to Donald Trump. I mean, there are anti-Semites in many places, but that's not simply the whole story of Poland. There were, and it took time to understand that. But certainly for most of these people, Poland was not a touchstone for a lot of them in terms of their internationalism at all.
I'll start with the gender question. That wasn't something I talked about today, but it's interesting that it's come up quite a bit. Although you don't really see that in Jerzy story, I'm struggling with the fact that I can't find sources on the women who I know were active in these movements. And although I have about 6 chapters which look at male activists, I've had to put my 3 female ones into 1 chapter because of how little source material I have, even though I know they were really active. And I don't really have an answer for why that is, apart from the patriarchy that existed in Australia at the time. But it's, certainly an issue. In terms of the transnational aspect, so Jerzy initially has very little contact with Poland at all, anything outside of Australia. In the mid-1960s, he starts this relationship with the Polish consuls in Sydney. Initially, I think it is really a business relationship. He's trying to start a new Polish newspaper in reaction to the one that's produced by the Polish community, which he feels is far too anti-left-wing. And he starts this relationship to get them to buy advertising space in the paper. I think it develops though, and I'm still trying to get a handle on this because ASIO sees espionage in every aspect of it, and I don't think that's what was happening. But he does end up coming back to Poland on about a 3-month trip in the mid-60s, and builds up some connections with journalists here. So I think his transnational political connections are actually with journalists rather than kind of socialist activists. But I think that's because of what he was trying to do at the time. I do think he definitely adopts or adapts these ideas to the local conditions, absolutely. I think he pulls from this really middle class kind of cultural milieu down to this working class one because he sees that that's what's happening for Polish and other migrants in Australia at the time. So definitely, I think his activism and his politics adapt to Australian conditions, but he does have some kind of link with Poland throughout as well.
I will jump on that about Transnational. So most of my activists had not really connection with Poland. The one I can answer this question too in a minute. But they really adapt to France. So when they arrived in France, it was like, okay, we are Jewish, we are communist, and we want to integrate into the country we are now in. And so they really, in their journal, in their press, for instance, you can see both some Yiddish culture thing to like bound the community because the Yiddish culture was important for them, but also a lot of things about French political life because the Jewish communists were trying also to make their followers to integrate in France while being still communist. But I would say it's a syncretism. All their politics in France is a syncretism between communism, like internationalism, communism, French politics and French Communist Party, and Jewishness. It's really a mixture of this. So about the one who left France to Poland, so in my group of 24 activists, it's only six of them, all among the high-ranking politicians. So they decided to go in Poland because they would have a better position than in France, actually, because they would play more important role than in the Communist Party in France. So they left, so 6 of them. And it's interesting also for the gender question, actually, because among these 6, there were 2 women who played, gender position in France, so they were working with children while they were in France. But in Poland, when they arrived, they didn't play a gender role anymore. One of them had a very important role. She was working with in an international library that was kind of important for the movement. And the other one was working in a journal as a journalist. She had a less important role than her husband, but so this is a gender fact. But she didn't have really a gender role like she had in France. And among these 6, only 2 stayed in, I think, only 2 stayed in Poland. And these 2 were the only one who, when they arrived in Poland, were not really in the Jewish communist activists. They were not defining themselves as Jews in Poland, and they played role in the Communist Party in general. So they managed to not be really attacked because of their Jewishness in '68. They stayed and died in Poland, but it's the only 2 and the one who felt less Jewish than the others, I would say. And finally, for the gender issue, and if women talk about it, so we don't have a lot of memoirs from women, but and their children, I ask questions, are not really saying, not giving any explanation about the choice of their mother. But there are 2 things that I can, 2 examples. First, in France in general, for instance, if you look at all the resistance fighters, Jews and non-Jews, I would say even non-Jews, you can notice that most of them who were decorated after the war were men. Not because there were most men in the resistance in general, but because usually, it has been shown by some researchers, women did not ask any recognition after the war, because they were like, I did what I had to do, it's like this. So women in the Communist Party, Jewish women in the groups I study, it was, okay, now I have children, I have to do something. I mean, we can't be both activists, so it's normal I'm going to stay with the children. And they don't seem to, I mean, nobody really explained to me when I asked the children, but she was a hero during the war. I mean, she lost a leg, for instance, because she was a fighter, and she was considered a hero. Why didn't she continue? So it was like this. She had to stay home, and she was happy with it. Like, okay. So, yeah, it's... but the second thing is, at that time, the French, so you know there are differences between all communist parties in Europe. I mean, we can discuss about the Moscow role in trying to shape this communist party, but the French Communist Party was more conservative than we can think about gender role and gender and women in general. It was kind of conservative in a lot of aspects, and men were privileged. And yeah, it was a
politically radical and culturally conservative.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I mean, about a lot of elements. So, and women were usually in my corpus, in my cohort, you can really see that they are always like doing women things, and they are not promoted to more important dimension.
This is the one thing I like about being a chair, that I can ask questions in the end. And all of them are methodological, concerning oral history and gender. So this of my fields of special interest. Let's start with oral history, because it also is connecting with this Jerzy a little bit. The question is, did you think about the fields of silence? What the interviewees did not speak about, and it especially refers to the interviews with the second generation. I think that children have always a very false mythical image of parents, and they do not believe in any kind of complicated stories unless they have daddy's issues or mommy issues. But this is a problem that sometimes they have much more reflect the public memory of the Communist Party than what's going on with the migrants. Because what I found interesting that, and this is the question whether it is in these interviews, is there anything about the French policy migration in the 20s and 30s, which is very special in the Europe, and what about the Great Crisis, which was a very important cause why France became a very friendly space for immigration. This is also the question of you, because it was your interviews. You did interviews with the children. What was your identity influenced the interviews? Because I think that always oral history interviews is the sort of a dialogue, and the interviewees take into account to whom they speak. And this is about your interviews with the family. Did you think what kind of difficulties connected with your being an insider, not as somebody who is outside the interviews? And the gender question, because I found this Jerzy story very interesting, but there is nothing about his private life. Is it because of lack of sources, or rather the typical thinking about political activists or Labour Party activists or Labour Union activists, that if they are male, we don't ask about the family things? Usually we ask about women who have a private life that is not a part of the biographies of political male actors. And another thing which came to my mind, this is the question in terms of the immigration, this, I would say this gender cultural capital of women, that they can always use this patriarchal assumption that all women are experts in raising children, working with small children, working in orphanages, and this is a sort of in this way they are much better prepared to find work as immigrants in these fields of gender related to private, family, and children spaces. That's why they do not work in their own professional areas. Do you have any questions?
One more question. It's a bit related to what you just asked. So you said that the children might have kind of like twisted perception of the parents' activism. So my question would be, what is the perception of the each community now to this Jewish communist narratives in Paterson, in Sydney, in Paris, right? It's if this narrative, if these histories are in any way included, embraced in the way how each community tells its story. I mean, to my impression, I was earlier this year in the Jewish Museum in Sydney, and then when you enter, like one of the first galleries is the Jewish involvement in the Australian army, and this is it means being good Australian. I mean, from my perception, as a visitor in the museum, and this kind of stories, it's somehow they are not that much included.
Sorry, just one more question quickly for Zoe. When you said they stayed communist in Paris, do they stay communist? I mean, I assume the answer is yes, but I wonder, do they stay communist in the sense of they're loyal to the Soviet Union and they're still kind of supporters of the Soviet bloc? Or are they communist in that way that, like my grandmother who emigrated from Poland was, where she said, communism is a beautiful ideology and, humans aren't grown up to it. So do they stay, I guess, small c communist or capital C communist after, 56 and 68?
I don't see any others, so please.
They are Stalinist. So the one I study, it's not representative because they were high-ranking. So a lot of, for them, losing the party was really difficult because their whole family, their whole friends were in the Communist Party. So a rupture was not really something they could do. But it's different from the rank-and-file activists. And we noticed that in the 60s, this organization find it really hard to bring new activists. So their children, for instance, they became Trotskyists during 68 in France, and they were not really communist, and this organization died with the death of their activists, who stayed Stalinist until the end. And in France, the French Communist Party hid the 20th, the report of the 20th Congress of the USSR. So in the French Communist Party, it was forbidden to talk about what had been said, even though in France everybody knew what has been said in the Congress. It was published in the press, in Le Monde, for instance. But in the French Communist Party, until the end of the 80s, you couldn't talk about it. And why? Because we had our own cult of personality with Torres, so we couldn't risk, so they couldn't really discuss it. There are some conflicts with some activists, but less high-ranking than the one I study. About children, so when I did interviews, I already knew their parents and I knew what they thought because I had documents on their parents, some documents in which their parents were clearly Stalinist people, and all the children are like, no, my dad was really intelligent and he was not really, he didn't believe everything that the French Communist Party wanted him to believe, and he was more, so they are always trying to show their parents were not Stalinist and were not, I have some texts that are very, very aggressive when during the Slansky trial, where Jewish communists are saying that Slansky is a traitor and all these Jews in the trial deserve to die, basically. And if I show that to children, they're like, no, it's not really what he thought, my father. So yeah, of course, they are like, there is a myth around their parents, that's for sure. How did my identity play the role? So I was lucky because my name, they knew my name because my great uncle is working a theater play, and is well known in France in Jewish life in general. And he went to colonies de vacances, like camps for children in summer with a lot of the children of activists I know. So they didn't really, I didn't present myself like this, but they were like, at one point they were like, oh, you're a member of Jean-Claude, a relative of Jean-Claude, and so they trust me more. Even though he's not a communist, they knew that maybe they could trust me more. So I guess it played a role, but I don't know if it would have been different. And there was a question about migration, and the third is?
Okay, there's a few things here. In terms of oral histories, so out of all of the people I'm looking at, Jerzy is actually the only one that I have an oral history interview for, which he did in about 2002, I think, which adds a really interesting dimension to what I'm able to do with his story. And certainly it's got some really interesting silences in it. When he first arrives, and this ties into the second point, I do have a lot of information on his private life, and that is in the broader work I've done. I didn't have room for it today. In his oral history, for example, he doesn't really mention his first wife at all. So when he arrives in Australia, he marries a Hungarian Jewish woman, and they're only married for about 18 months, I think. He really struggles. So once they get out here and get married, they then sponsor her family to migrate out from Hungary as well. They arrive, they're all living in the same house, and Jerzy's perception is that because he is not Jewish, or considers himself not Jewish, he is at the bottom of the family hierarchy, and that her father and her brothers treat him as though he is the absolute bottom below all of the children, and he thinks this is what breaks the marriage up. But that's something which is almost absent from his oral history, and he doesn't speak about it much at all, but it then figures quite large in his ASIO file. He then, after they get divorced, he then goes and denounces her family as all being communists, and ASIO take a little while to figure it out, and once they figure out he's denouncing his ex-wife's family, they think a little more carefully about the information he's providing. And there's a lot of gendered aspects in there as well, obviously. In terms of the perceptions of the communities now and how this figures into their narratives, it's a great question. Part of the reason I don't have, or I haven't been able to do oral histories with anyone else that I'm looking at, is because they won't talk to me. So in 1954, Australia has a huge defection. So Vladimir Petrov is a secretary at the Soviet embassy in Canberra. He defects. At this point, it's the highest level Soviet defection. It causes what we now call the Petrov Affair, which results in a royal commission into espionage. As a result, so a lot of the people I'm looking at are tied up with that kind of community that had contact with Petrov. They find out because of this royal commission that they've been under surveillance the whole time, and then they become extremely secretive. So thus far, I'm still working on it, and I really have my fingers crossed, but thus far I haven't been able to get anyone to talk to me, I think because of that kind of culture of silence that results after 54. The exception is the Jewish community. who are far more, the Sydney Jewish community are far more open to the left-wing element to their story in Sydney. That said, I think they're open to it in terms of these Jewish groups, not the people who hung around the fringes, like Yerji, who are involved but kind of not involved. And they're not so open to the trade union part of the narrative. There's lots, they love to talk about the Jewish folk centre, Volkscenter in Sydney, all of the councils to combat fascism and anti-Semitism and the activism that they had. But the trade union bit is missing, which is interesting in and of itself as well.
Well, oral histories. I've written a fair amount about this over the last 50 years, and you should note I don't do any of the oral histories in this book for this book. They're based. They were interviews done by my students over the years and by third-party people who interviewed my aunt and my uncle and others. Martha Stone Asher writes her own history. I certainly know that very few of us want to tell stories, and when we're asked about our lives, want to focus on the things we feel embarrassed about and don't want to talk about. So we all create our own narratives, and so I'm very self-conscious about talking about those kinds of things. Domestic life is an important part of the story. I began this book with a narrative about my grandfather. My grandmother I was always being told that my grandfather was always complaining that my grandmother was never home because she was always getting arrested and she was never home to do the cook dinner. So I knew from the outset that this was a story in which a woman was doubly radical, both as a feminist, as a woman, and as a communist. And so that always informed my story. I learned much later on about the role of patriarchy as I was proceeding with this book. My grandfather, who was a heroic figure as in the story generally as it's told by relatives, was also a vicious child beater. But in that sense, he was just a good American and good paternalist. This was true of a lot of patriarchal traditions in all of our countries. He was a little more out of control, I think, than others. But patriarchy becomes an important part of the story. You can't not talk about the Jewish family without talking about those kinds of things. So it becomes a part of that kind of narrative. When I ask people about my grandmother, my cousins always remember her as a homebody who just stayed home. And I originally was going to begin this story by talking about memory and about the different stories I had about my grandmother, when in fact, when I then started doing archival research, I discovered that she was the one holding the family together. She testified before the House On-American Activities Committee. So there were obviously multiple roles that these people played in different kinds of imaginings that went on. So that's, yes, a part of the story. And when we talk about oral history, we need to remember all the time that they're the stories people choose to tell, and they're only the stories about people we choose to talk to. And we can't talk to those people who are no longer with us, among others. So that has to be a part of the analysis as we proceed. Secondly, I just briefly was going to say about the story today, Paterson or elsewhere. I was just in Paris, and I was struck by the new Museum of Jewish History and Culture. The story of the Jewish left is virtually invisible other than in an opening paragraph, just not there at all. And I would say, given I've written a book about this in 8 or 12 countries, most Jewish history museums, heritage museums, are Holocaust museums. That's what they are. That's what the focus is. There's lots of reasons for that have to do as much with anything else. The story about the place of Israel after 1967 in American politics and in Jewish diaspora politics. So that by and large, they don't want to know much about that history. This museum is an exception to that, and it's beginning to change the possibilities for narratives elsewhere. This museum is becoming quite influential in rethinking that story. It's about 1,000 years. The Holocaust is just one piece of 8 different sections of this museum. But if you go to most museums, that's all they are Holocaust museums. And so the story of the Bund, the story of Jewish left, Jewish socialists, the pre-war story generally, the story of the trade union movement, is limited to one kiosk or plays a very minimal role in most of the narratives. It's not a story people want to hear about. And the museum curators may want to talk more about it, but they believe the public doesn't, who comes into these places, and funders don't. There are many competing stakeholders in these kinds of stories. And the place we have today is to go out and see that those stories become more inclusive. But that's still a struggle that has to be fought.
if I can jump on that. So in France, for instance, if you have a look at the main Holocaust museum, le Mémorial de la Shoah, it was created, his ancestry was created in 1943 by a group of Jewish resistance fighters who were not communist. They, however, created an alliances between all Jewish groups during World War II in 1943 and 1944. But soon after the war, there were major tension between Jewish communists and others, and the one who created this first museum excluded communists from it. So it might explain why today is it more a museum of the history of Jews, but not really communist Jews. And Jewish communists don't really have their own museum, but they're actually trying to. So there is a small group of the children of the activists I'm studying who recreated all the association I focus in my PhD, but transformed it in memory associations. So there are a few of them, and they are meeting in the historic place where these Jewish communist people met, in the near La Place de la République in Paris, which was a very Jewish communist and Yiddishist area in Paris. And they are, since 10 years now, they are trying to create what they called a virtual museum, because they don't have any money to create a museum. So they are creating their own virtual, it means online museum about Jewish communists and Jewish resistance. But they are not part of the main memory today, also because today in France, the Jewish community today is much more right-wing, less Yiddishist and more Sephardi. Most Jews in France come from the decolonization process, and a lot of Ashkenazi Jews melt in French population, and the remnants of this history are really a minority today. So, yeah.
Thank you for the last comment, which shows that memory is also a very important part of the research, and also that nothing is very easy and simple, and everything is more complex.